Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Instant Takes. I don't think they're actually called editions. I don't know. I'll have to admit, I am fairly new to this. John does this more often than I do. But, so I have seen 2 new Netflix films. I was very lucky to get a pair of screenings this week for 2 high-profile Netflix films in a theater, which feels odd because, you know, I keep reading all these articles about Netflix being very adamant about not supporting the theatrical experience, but I will say the screenings themselves, for however I feel about the films I'll discuss, were very nice, and I was fortunate to have seen them in the theatrical presentation, and I can only wish that they provided that experience more often for their customers, but that's neither here nor there. So let's call this mini-series Netflix and Will. just why not? And the 2 films I've seen are Emilia Pérez, which I saw on Tuesday, and The Piano Lesson, which I saw on Monday. Since it's a little bit fresher in my mind, let's start with Emilia Pérez. In the next episode, you'll hear what I have to say about The Piano Lesson, but I think I have to vent a little bit about Emilia Pérez. Now, I should say, this was a fairly high-profile film earlier this summer when it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. It has some big names. It has Zoe Saldaña and Selena Gomez, but also some actors who I don't think maybe are as well known, at least in the States, as those 2 names I mentioned. And the big star, I should say here, is Karla Sofía Gascón, who I believe was a telenovela actress, who has recently, with this film, and maybe a few others, made the transition into features. And she is a trans actress who, if I'm not mistaken, I know one of the actors involved won Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival. That was the award it won, along with a special grand jury prize. It was a big deal because it's the new film from Jacques Audiard. I am probably butchering that, unfortunately, but if you're a cinephile, you probably have seen a handful of his films, if not 1 or 2 maybe. The one I know best is A Prophet, which came out, I believe, in 2009. But he also won the Palme d'Or for Dupin a few years back. He also did Rust and Bone with Marion Cotillard. I think more recently, he did The Sister Brothers, which was his, I believe, English language debut. That had Joaquin Phoenix and John C. Reilly. This film is stylistically a fairly big departure for him. His other films, at least the ones I've seen, I haven't seen Dupin, I should say. He also had another one, I think it was Paris 13th District. I think that was his most recent one. That came out a couple years ago. I never got around to seeing that one. I heard it was pretty good, though. But this film, his other movies have strived for a more kind of grounded, Dardenne brother maybe influence, grounded realism. And the Emilia Pérez is a full-out musical. But it's a musical in a Jacques Demy sort of way, in a sense that, like, it has these big, extravagant sort of musical numbers, but it's going for a more sort of like free-flowing kind of singy kind of thing where even when the characters kind of bust out in the song, it has kind of more of a slice of life sort of like spur of the moment type of singing. Characters won't really be rhyming. They'll just kind of be doing that. Like, I guess a Western example would be something like Les Mis, which may not be the best comparison, but I just as a point of reference, that's kind of what you can expect in terms of style from this film. So critics, I will say at the festival, were very much about the film, which got me understandably excited. It got an acquisition, as I mentioned, from Netflix. They have really high Oscar hopes, and there's a decent to good chance that at the very least, it'll get nominated for Best Foreign Language Film. It's France's submission. It's a Spanish language film, I should say, but it is a French film from a French filmmaker. And that will be relevant for what I'm going to say a little bit later. But the film is also getting some consideration, I believe, for Best Actress, for the 3 leads, as well as, I think, picture and screenplay and maybe even director at this point. And I went into this with, I guess, fairly hopeful ambitions, but I do know that since it's been, I think, at like the New York Film Festival and a few other prestigious film festivals, maybe TIFF, the conversation around the film has gotten a little bit more divisive. I think this is the type of film that is going to inspire the dreaded discourse. It is focused, I should say. And it's one of those films that, for a number of reasons, I don't really want to dive into the plot because, for one, it's a fairly unwieldy sort of plot. It's something that you just kind of, if you are going to see it in a theater like I did, you kind of want to strap down and just get ready for a sort of tumbling experience, because it kind of goes in a number of odd, sort of disjointed directions that I don't know if people are going to expect. I certainly didn't expect the directions it sort of went. But it is a film that, as I mentioned before, it is centered around a trans character. It is primarily set in Mexico City. It is a film that is primarily Spanish language, which is really cool to see from, like Zoe Saldaña and Selena Gomez. You just don't really get the chance to see them perform Spanish language characters. And that was, I think at the very least, I think that's one of the many reasons why this film is very intriguing. But I will say, as a film itself, it's a big swing. And I've talked a lot in the podcast about movies that kind of go for it in ways that I really do enjoy. Even if I don't love the film, I do love the big swing. I mean, most recently, we saw that with Megalopolis, the Francis Ford Coppola movie. Far from perfect film, and I wish we had a chance to talk about it on the show, but John never saw it, so que sera. But, even like The Substance, not a film I love, but that is a film that, another French film that premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, that is going for it in a big way. We've seen, like, Annette, another musical. There's another one that came out not too long ago. Oh, I was thinking Fox Lux, I love that movie. These other films that, for better or for worse, I think they kind of go for the big swing, and I think generally they work, or at least for me they work. I can't speak for everybody. A lot of those films were considerably divisive, but this one, I don't know if it's just because it's such a departure for Audiard, the filmmaker. I'm horribly butchering that name. I'm so sorry, but it is a film that, like, it is going for something kind of big and melodramatic and broad, and I think the problem here is that it never really settles on one particular thing. I think a film doesn't need to settle necessarily, but it is so actively and restlessly trying to do a number of different things that it never really feels like you get a chance to settle into it. The musical numbers are very fast and brazen, but they aren't really like catchy or sort of like investing in any particular sense. They're choreographed pretty interestingly, and there are some really fun dance moves, but it's not the type of film where you're like that invested from a musical standpoint, because not only do a lot of the musical numbers feel sort of extraneous, but they have a sort of like, I don't know, oddly indifferent sort of presentation at times. That's not to say that like the director doesn't care about them, but the songs, I'm not going to sing on this podcast. I'll be gracious enough not to do that for you guys, but they have a sort of like, it'd be like me being like, I'm going on the podcast. No, I need to record. I don't know what to do. It's not like a rhyming sort of like melody driven sort of thing. It's just kind of like them working their feelings through song, and they're not particularly engaging. It kind of gets old after a while. There are a couple musical interludes that are kind of fascinating and even somewhat enjoyable. One I can think of, and one will probably be the big standout, is about midway through. There's like this scene at a like gala sort of like benefit dinner that Zoe Saldaña is doing this sort of like big extravagant tackling of like her restless feelings about having to work with some not so good characters for this financial reason. And it is a kind of like go for broke big musical number that I think it is kind of fun. I think that was like the only big musical number that I can think of where I was really kind of latched onto the film. As far as like the kind of quieter musical numbers go, there's one early on involving Zoe Saldaña again and a doctor that I think there's a little bit more harmony or a little bit more sort of connectivity to that musical number that I think made for at least an interesting sort of sequence. But the rest, I don't know, it's very sort of touch and go. It is kind of the type of thing where you're either with it or you're not. I think it's the type of thing that I don't see a lot of Western audiences really connecting to this. And I would be very curious to hear, like, from Selena Gomez fans, what they're going to think of this, because this is, I will give her credit. It's not a performance I love. I think of the three leads, she's definitely the weakest, and I'll talk a little bit more about the two leads in a moment. But as far as Selena Gomez goes, it is a notable departure from what we've seen from her before. Granted, I never watched that much of like Wizards of Waverly Place, or I haven't watched Only Murderers in the Building, or a lot of her TV credits. I think film-wise, my big point of reference is like Ramona and Beezus or something. I apologize that that's not the most timely or relevant reference as far as Selena Gomez goes. But that is all to say that I think even though she has moved away from the sort of Disney perception, I forgot all about like Spring Breakers and looking up her film, and obviously like Hotel Transylvania. But I guess that kind of goes, I guess Spring Breakers is only really comparable as far as like her tackling a directly more adult sort of role and film. I mean, I know she had like a cameo in The Big Short, but this is definitely a more, not only like mature role, but definitely one that's like requiring her to be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more unlikable, a little bit more unsettled as a screen presence. And I don't think it fully works for me, and I don't think it really works for the film either, but I can admire, again, like with the director here, I admire the ambition, and I admire the desire to do something against the grain for her and against what audience would, I think, expect from her. But I do think, you know, in this kind of big, bombastic sort of film and presentation, her performance always felt like that. Sort of just never really connected to, I think, any sort of emotional honesty to the character. It always, to me, felt like it was, you know, trying to kind of, I guess, connect in a theatrical sort of way, but never in a gripping or investing sort of way. As far as the other two leads go, I mean, I mentioned already Zoe Saldaña, who I think is truly, I think, an underrated actress. It's a weird thing to say that, because like I don't think she's like one of the highest grossing as far as like richest actresses in the world, but you know, if you look at her filmography, she's in like, I had to assume like 6 of the 30 highest grossing films of all time. You know, she's obviously in the 2 Avatar films. She's in like Avengers Endgame and Infinity War. At least Infinity War. I forget if she's in Endgame. But she's in like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. She's in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. She's in Star Trek. You know, all these pretty high profile films. But, you know, these are fairly big blockbusters. And that's not to say that they don't challenge her. I think she's tremendous in that first Avatar. And I think that was a performance that, you know, kind of similar like Andy Serkis. I think people overlooked how good she was in that film because of the motion capture. But that's a whole other discussion. That's not related to Emilia Pérez. As far as this film goes, though, I think this is really a great showcase for her. I mean, I didn't really know what she could bring before I watched the film musically and creative, you know, from a dramatic standpoint. I wasn't really sure what to expect from her. But, you know, she's really connected and really trying to make a big swing out of this. And, you know, I think ultimately from an emotional standpoint, the film, it really does belong to Karla Sofîa Gascón. You know, it is such a tender, touching sort of performance. I have heard, and because this is an instant take, I don't really know where I sit on this. It's something I think I'm going to have to read more about and maybe think on a little bit more. As far as its representation of trans identity, I think it's at least being sincere. I have heard some people claim that it is fairly transphobic. I've heard some people say it's actually fairly inclusive. I don't know. I don't think it fully works in that respect, but I think there is a sincerity here. I think there is a desire to tell a trans story in a nuanced and powerful sort of way. And I don't think it comes from a place of insensitivity. I could change my tune on that. I don't know. I'm just kind of going off of what I'm feeling at the moment. And I'm not a trans person myself, so I can't really speak to that in full, I don't think. But I will say, as far as the film's depiction of Spanish language culture, it does, at least for me as a Westerner, I again can't speak to how it portrays Mexico necessarily, but I will say it does really feel like it's relying, especially in the third act, on a lot of like tired and sort of outdated sort of stereotypes. It does feel, that's where like the French filmmakers coming into Spain, I think, feels a little bit more prevalent. It does kind of feel like it's not really honoring the nuances of the culture, the integrity and the the depths and layers of this culture. It does feel very sort of detached in a way that feels, I don't know, offensive is too broad of a word. I don't know if it's quite there, but it doesn't feel real in that sense. And like I said, this is kind of going for a sort of melodramatic, larger in life sort of story and telling and all that. But I do have to admit that, by the end of this, or at least by the third act, I wasn't really fully with it throughout. And I wanted to be. I wasn't trying to go into this as a hater or anything. And I like the director's previous films. And I like the actresses involved and all that. But I just think it goes for the fences, but it just doesn't fully land there. And I can appreciate the effort. I can see why it's connecting with some people. I wish I was in the positive camp on this one, but unfortunately, it's just, I don't know. It's just not for me. I think it's going to inspire a lot of good and bad conversation. I would be very curious to talk about with one John Negroni, if he ever gets around to seeing it. It's hard to know these days what he even sees. But I think, it's going to be one that's going to continue to be in the conversation because of Oscar season and all that. So I don't think this is the last I have talked about Emilia Pérez, and I'm sure my opinion on the film is going to evolve or maybe even devolve as time goes on. But these are sort of my rambling early thoughts on the film. Yeah, not a thumbs up from me, but, they can't all be winners. They can't all be my thing. I don't know. But yeah, that's my early instant take on Emilia Pérez, which should be in theaters pretty soon. It also will be on Netflix, I think, by late November, early December. Definitely one that's going to be in the conversation, but we'll see what that conversation is like later on. All right, be on the lookout for my little instant thoughts on The Piano Lesson.